Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. The phrase Batman and Robin is one of the most well-known in superhero media, but today we're asking what happens when the character of Robin goes out on their own. We're looking at Tim Drake coming out as being queer. We're looking at the rivalry between Dick Grayson and Jason Todd as both of them struggle with what does it mean to no longer be Batman's sidekick. We're looking at all the questions that come up, and we're doing that with comic book whiz Jessica Plummer. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew, your host. And not every time, but most of the time we dive, especially into characters from the comics. I'm joined by Jessica Plummer. Jessica, who is constantly telling me that Batman is not her favorite, but I keep finding ways to get her to talk about people from the Batman universe. And I'm really glad you're here today to talk about when Robins leave the nest. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, and this is kind of an odd topic we're talking about, so let me kind of tell the story of how this came about. And so what inspired this was, not long ago, we found out that Tim Drake, who is the third of the Robins after Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, the third person to wear the mantle of Robin in partnership with Batman, who now is sort of using the Robin title because Damian Wayne is out of town. I don't quite understand it, but Jessica's going to help fill us all in on that when we get to that. But the point is that it was announced that in an upcoming comic, which I believe has now been released, or at least the cover's been released, he is now canonically queer. He is shown flirting with, and then I think kissing and beginning a relationship with another man. He is also masculine presenting and male identified in the comics. And so I was super excited about this. Jessica and I started talking about this, and it got us into this great discussion about the character of Robin, or the archetype of Robin, and how so many different people have worn that mantle, and what does that mean, and what does it mean to have, this Tim Drake character kind of off on his own, the way Dick Grayson is, the way Jason Todd is. And we were already kind of bouncing that idea around and trying to decide how to get a handle on it, at which point the third season of HBO's TV show, Titans, was released. I started watching season 1 because I was really excited about it, and there'll be some mild spoilers for season 1, but I'll try not to get too much into it. But for anyone who has not seen it, the star of that show, or at least one of the kind of lead of the ensemble, is Dick Grayson. And the show is about Dick Grayson learning to live while he is no longer Robin, or at least is trying to decide if he is going to keep being Robin while he's no longer working with Batman. And along the way, he runs into Jason Todd, who is still Robin, and there's conflict there. And it just sort of raised all these great questions about what is this character of Robin, the archetype of Robin that so many different characters have filled, and what does it mean that we're getting all these great stories about not only Batman and Robin, but what happens when that Robin, like I said, leaves the nest, becomes no longer partner with Batman, but gets to go off and do their own stories. So, Jessica, I'm so excited you can be a part of this, and kind of that's my take on the kind of intro. Where are you coming from in terms of like this topic we're talking about, and kind of your overall thoughts on it?
So I mean, as you said earlier, Batman is not my favorite. I don't hate him, but he's not my favorite. But I have loved the idea of Robin, even before I really got into comics. Like the idea always really appealed to me. I love the idea of kid sidekicks. And when I started to read comics, started to dabble in comics, it was in like 2003, 2004, which is when Stephanie Brown, who is the fourth Robin, the only girl Robin in main continuity, briefly became Robin. And I still remember how I felt seeing a girl Robin on the stands. And I was not a kid in 2004. I was in college. But it resonated so strongly with me, and I became a diehard fan like in the instant of seeing that comic book cover. Of course, they killed her off a few months later because it was a stunt. But she's back now. She's fine. But yeah, I've just always very much been drawn to kid sidekicks and Robin in particular. And I am so excited for Tim. I'm so happy for him. And very, very happy to talk about Robins.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting thing because for anyone who's listened to the comic book history episodes that we've done, where it's mostly me interviewing Jess because Jess knows so much more about this than I do, And in those, we've really gone deep into like all these different periods of comic book history and how Robin was a kind of really important character to be added to Batman, in part to fight some homoeroticism ideas, and with a lot of homophobia wrapped up there that we're definitely going to get into. So yeah, I think it's such an interesting direction for the Tim Drake character to go, and we're going to get into that. But let's just start by doing kind of a quick rundown. Can you, Jessica, and I'll kind of probably stop with questions, so it's not just a monologue, but give us kind of just a quick rundown of who have been the 5 Robins we've gotten, and we're especially tonight focusing on the original 3, Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, Tim Drake. Give us kind of just a quick rundown on who they are.
Okay, and this is, to clarify, these are the Robins in continuity, so it doesn't touch on like Carrie Kelly, who is Robin in The Dark Knight Returns, and there are other, if you really want to pull up a list of, 30 people who have been Robin, you can do that. Like Superboy was Robin, but these are the real Robins.
Okay.
So the first was Dick Grayson. If you've ever seen a movie or a TV show with Robin, it was almost certainly Dick Grayson, and if it wasn't, then it's something like Titans or Batman the Animated Series, where he was the first Robin, and then somebody else comes along, like Jason or Tim.
Right.
He debuted in 1940. He was a circus acrobat along with his parents, and his parents were killed by gangsters who sabotaged the trapeze in order to get the circus owner to pay protection money. Bruce Wayne happened to be in the audience, and he saw this young boy horribly orphaned and, felt a kinship with him because of it, and so he adopted him. And depending on, the story has been told and retold ad nauseum. In fact, DC just announced they're going to be doing another retelling starting in November.
At this point, I feel like the trapeze swing that's empty is only second to the pearls breaking in terms of like most iconic Batman shots.
Absolutely, 100%. So depending on which story, like there are some where Bruce is like, hey, that orphan kid's going to be a great sidekick. And there are some where he's like, he'll probably never figure out that I dress up like a bat and fight crime. Both of which are not great.
Right.
Bruce wasn't really thinking about the future, I don't think. But he takes Dick in. Dick, in whatever way, finds out that Bruce is Batman and becomes Robin. And Dick was Robin from 1940 to 1984, which is a very long run, but he has been Nightwing, which is the sort of adult name that he took on in 1984, for almost as long, which is crazy to me because I think of Nightwing as being a very modern aspect of the character, and B, I was born in 1984, so it just makes me feel old.
No, it's still new. And is Nightwing when he has broken with Batman, Nightwing is kind of off on his own, or does Nightwing still work in partnership with Batman?
Yeah, Nightwing is very much off on his own. So in 1980, the Teen Titans have been around since 1966. But in 1980, we got the new Teen Titans, which was a more adult, edgier version. Like the 1966 version is very much like, they're like constantly doing the twist and talking in like teen slang and like going to beach parties where there's surfing. It's great. It's delightful, but no teenager has ever been anything like that. And starting in 1980, the DC was basically trying to capitalize on the popularity of X-Men, who were older teens and very angsty. And so this is when you get characters like Starfire and Raven and Cyborg debuting. So the lineup that you're familiar with from Titans, from the animated Teen Titans, most of those characters, if they didn't debut in 1980, like Beast Boy is from the 60s, but he joined the Titans in 1980.
Got it. Okay.
So at that point, Dick was already he had already gone off to college. Right. He and Bruce were very tense, and he was an adult. He was like 20. Yeah. He was ready to be his own man, and things were getting more and more tense. And then finally he decided he was done being Robin. He didn't know what he wanted to be next. And right around the same time, Bruce meets another 12-year-old orphan circus acrobat.
Oh,
uh,
wow. Okay. So really the same kind of character.
oh yeah, when Jason was first introduced, he was straight up a ripoff of Dick. They literally, like, Dick's family was the Flying Graysons and
Mm-hmm.
Jason's was the Flying Todds. It
Oh,
was
boy.
it was not subtle.
Like, we're not going to be saying a lot of positive things about Bruce Wayne overall, but I have to start with, already, if a friend of mine is dating someone and then they break up and then they start dating someone who's very similar to them, I'm going to raise an eyebrow. I think with foster children, that dynamic is significantly worse.
Oh, it's so much worse than you think because Jason, when he was originally introduced, had like strawberry blonde hair that he had
Oh,
to
no.
dye
Oh,
black
no.
to look more like Dick so that criminals wouldn't know that Robin had changed. Dick was 20 and Jason was 12. They were gonna know.
Oh, God. Now, one of the things that I now today think of as very essential to the Dick Grayson character, and I think is a very important part of the conversation we're going to have, is that Dick, and I think this is definitely in the Titans show, it's definitely in the Batman the Animated Series, and I think it's in a couple of other places, but that Dick's parents also died because of crime. Often
Yes.
because the Flying Grit, they owed money to a crime family or some kind, and that Bruce Wayne sees in Dick another child who desperately wants revenge in the same way that he did. And so part of why he leads Robin into the life of, crime fighting is because he believes that, like, he needs to help Robin channel his desire for revenge in the same way his were channeled. Has that always been a part of the great? Well, I'm sure it hasn't, given like comic code stuff, but has that for a long time been part of the Grayson character? And was that also part of the Jason Todd character?
Um, it's definitely, to a greater or lesser extent, yes, it has always been part of Dick's character, at least that, like, Bruce and Dick see one another in each other's origins. Like, you two were orphaned as a young boy by crime. You want to either get revenge or stop this from happening to somebody else. Like, there are, more
Mm-hmm.
altruistic or more vengeful ways that it's been interpreted. But yeah,
Right.
absolutely. That's definitely a through line. And I've seen people point this out in like commentary, and I also think it's actually said out loud in the comics that Dick as a person, as a character, not that he's not, they are all extremely damaged individuals. Everybody in the Bat family needs to be in
Yeah.
therapy for the entire rest of their lives. But Dick overall is significantly healthier than Bruce. Like, he has functional relationships,
Mm,
not romantic ones. Those are disasters, but he has functional friendships. And
right.
like, he is he is generally, speaking very generally, a happier and more together individual while also teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown at all times.
Okay.
But
Okay.
like in a more somewhat more functional way. Like, he doesn't live alone in a cave.
Okay.
Um, and the argument has been made many times that he did not become Bruce because he had Bruce.
I can see that. Okay. And that's certainly, and that I think in some ways that is a bit of a defense of Bruce, and that I think Bruce at times has said things like that, is that he doesn't want Dick to turn into someone just like him, even though
No.
of course he does. And then certainly that's part of the story of trying to shift from vengeance towards altruism, of, punish the ones who did it versus stop others from doing it again, is definitely something that Bruce tries to push him towards. But yes, I think, and certainly the show Titans, one of the things that I'm most enjoyed about it is how much it is exploring, that maybe for the 12-year-old boy whose parents had been killed, being adopted by Bruce and adopted into the life of Batman and Robin was not the most therapeutically helpful thing for him. And in that show, I think he's a lot more damaged than what you're discussing, but it's very much being described in terms of like what happened by being adopted by Bruce. So we'll get to that in a bit. Talk to me now about more Jason Todd. Does Jason Todd also have that revenge / you've seen evil, you should fight evil kind of story?
I mean, he does now. So, like I was saying, when he was first introduced in 1983, he was also a circus acrobat. And then his parents were eaten by crocodiles, which is hilarious to me.
Okay. Not Killer Croc, though. Actual
Yes,
crocodiles. Okay.
Killer Croc fed them to the crocodiles at the zoo.
Okay. So it wasn't
Yes.
just like a random crocodile. It was Killer Croc was involved, but actual crocodiles. Got
Right.
it.
No, it's not like how in the comics Green Arrow's parents originally were eaten by lions just because they happened to be on safari, which is a true thing, and it's endlessly funny to me.
I mean, if we've got to talk about white tourism and bounty hunting and,
They
trophy hunting and the like.
they
But
were
anyway,
literally poaching and they deserved it, but
there you
that's
go.
beside the point.
There you go.
So yeah, Jason originally had a very similar origin, and then a couple years later, DC was like, "What if we made him a different character and he wasn't just the same?" So they revised his character, and instead of being a circus acrobat, he was a street kid whose father was like a petty criminal who was dead. His mother was a drug addict who had also recently passed away, and so he was living on his own. And he meets Batman when he tries to steal the tires off the Batmobile.
Okay.
And Bruce catches him, and Jason hits him in the stomach with the tire iron and runs away.
I mean, aim high, kid. I appreciate this,
It's so good. And Bruce is like, "That's hilarious. Do you want to be Robin?" And Jason's like, "Okay." It's pretty great.
Okay.
So early on he was not really motivated by vengeance, and actually it's funny in the original iteration after his parents are eaten by crocodiles. So Dick actually feels very personally responsible for this because like they're circus people and he knew them and it's complicated. So he tries to adopt Jason, and Bruce is like, "Too late, I'm already adopting him."
Oh boy.
Which is really, like, from what you've said, I don't watch Titans, but from what you've said, there's a fairly contentious relationship between Jason and Dick, and certainly they have a contentious relationship now in the comics. So the idea that, like, at one point Dick was like, "I'm 18, I can adopt a child."
Yeah. So far,
funny.
I've not seen Dick try to adopt Jason, but the dynamic between them is very interesting. And I think it's being, so far at least, very well done in terms of highlighting all the broken dynamics. Because, while Dick is in this place of, wow, Batman was terrible, I should never have been Robin, look at how much it screwed me up. And so he sees Jason and thinks, Jason, you need to get free of this. You shouldn't be this anymore. And Jason Todd is just 100% rah-rah, like, oh, I love being Batman and Robin. Being Robin's the greatest thing ever. He also has, like, a street criminal thing. And there's an interesting thing of, like, he wants to beat up cops because cops beat up on him. And I think the writers meant that to be, like, look at how troubled Jason is. But I was kind of like, yeah, beat up cops. Cops beat up street people.
You,
like,
Jason.
Go for you. But it does create in Dick, and I think to me this is one of the most interesting dynamics, and it sounds like this is someone in the comics, what you see from Dick is that he's very torn. Because it's kind of the thing, like when I did therapy work, was we studied a lot, like, you can leave an abusive partner, recognize that that partner was abusive and that you are better without them, but then you see them with a new partner, and there's a part of you that might be jealous or might think, oh, why can they have a healthy relationship when I couldn't? Or am I being replaced? Or just, all of those kind of very natural things about watching someone else be in the unhealthy relationship that you were in yourself. And I think, obviously, this isn't a romantic situation. It's a parental one, which is different, but has a lot of the same dynamics. The show, I think, is doing a very interesting job portraying that, conflict. Like, Jason so far is kind of we haven't really gotten much from his point of view. I'm sure my listeners who've probably seen all of it are writing in to tell me all the things that I'm missing, and I apologize I was not able to zoom through the first two seasons I wanted to, just life happened. But I think, Dick, to me, the situation Dick is placed in is very interesting in terms of this question of Robin's life beyond Batman, because it's clear that he thinks he's better off. It's clear that he feels sorry for this Jason guy. It's clear, though, that he also feels replaced and feels kind of sad and bitter about that.
Yeah, and I would say that that's very true to the comics. I mean, they have a different dynamic because they are definitely older in Titans. And like I said, Jason is 12 when he first becomes Robin. So there's that added element of, like, Dick is like 20 and he can't he's definitely, there's some hurt feelings there, but he can't blame Jason because Jason didn't actually do anything and is also literally a child.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that it's not a painful situation for him. And so he kind of just avoids it. Like, there's very, very little interaction between Dick and Jason because Dick is just not around when Jason is Robin. And also, Dick very much created the Robin identity. Like, Bruce did not say, you're going to be Robin and this is why. Robin, in many versions of the story, was literally Dick's mother's nickname for him.
Oh, okay.
Because he was born on the first day of spring.
Aww.
Yeah, it's cute. So, like, I mean, if I had an identity based on my late parents' nickname for me, and then my new parent was like, I gave it to another kid. Yeah, I'd be pretty upset.
I think that would cause some bitterness, you know?
There's a lot of bitterness, and the bitterness lasts for a long time. And also, like, Bruce is very bad at reaching out to people and being functional. So, like, when Jason dies, spoiler, when Jason dies, he doesn't tell Dick. Dick, like,
oh, wow.
Yeah, Dick misses the funeral because Bruce just didn't tell him. But it's because Bruce is, like, incapable of functioning. The other thing is that, like I said, they, like, kind of have their little race to see who can adopt Jason first. Bruce had not adopted Dick at that point.
So, really? He never legally adopts Dick? He does, in the comics?
He legally adopts him years after Jason's death, when Tim is Robin and Dick is, like, fully an adult. Bruce is like, I made a lot of mistakes and I know this doesn't fix everything, but I would like to adopt you if you're on board with that. And Dick says yes, and, like, it's part of a step towards repairing their relationship. But
nice.
Yeah, it's a very nice moment. But again, like, he instantly tried to adopt Jason and didn't even think about it with Dick.
All right, so let's talk to us about Jason's death and then rebirth, and let's get back into, then we'll move on to Tim Drake.
Right, so Jason was Robin for really a very short time, and then in 1988-89, DC was thinking about killing him off, but they weren't sure if they could get away with killing off Robin, so they very infamously, there was a 1-900 number you could call. Like, they told this story where Jason, he finds out that his biological mother is still alive, which he didn't know that the woman who raised him wasn't his mother. So he goes looking for her, and it turns out that she's, like, all tangled up with the Joker for complicated reasons. And he ends up in the clutches of the Joker, and then fans could call a 1-900 number and vote whether or not he survived.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And apparently, like, the part of the reason that they decided to do this was because Jason was quite unpopular, because people saw him as, like, being a ripoff of Dick, and they wanted Dick. They didn't want this new replacement.
Right.
But the vote was actually really close, and there are theories that, like, the same guy voted to kill him, like, hundreds of times. Like, that.
Notable, by the way, for those who are not of that generation, 1-900 numbers were you had to pay for. So, yes. Like, I imagine there were an awful lot of, like, 15-year-olds who called and called and called, and then had interesting conversations when the parents discovered the phone bill of, like, all these 900 numbers that were called. But yeah, so there's some true dedication or some true angry parents, either one. But go on.
It's funny too, because Jason, like, lost comics' biggest popularity contest. He is now arguably the most popular Robin. He is insanely popular with the same kind of fans who probably would have called to kill him off in 1988.
Interesting.
But yeah, he lost. They voted to kill him, and so the Joker beats him practically to death with a crowbar, and then blows up the warehouse that he's in. And Batman kind of goes off the deep end for a bit. Again, understandably, this is his son. So Jason would be dead for a really long time. He returns in 2005. And due to, like, it turns out he actually came back to life pretty shortly after he died, but he just has been, like, under the radar. So he has grown to adulthood, and now he's in his early 20s. He takes the name Red Hood, which had been used by the Joker early in his career, so it's like a way of reclaiming,
Right.
something that had been done to him. And basically, he's furious that Bruce did not kill the Joker and
Okay.
replaced him with a new Robin. Like, he's not mad that Bruce let him die. He's mad that Bruce continued to do exactly the same things that led to his death.
Interesting. Okay.
So he
Okay.
returns as basically a supervillain, and he kills bad guys. Like he does not successfully kill any innocent people, but he does try to kill Tim a few times.
Okay.
He doesn't succeed, but he attacks Tim, he attacks Dick, he attacks Bruce. He's very, very angry. And over the past, 15, 16 years since he's been back, he's mellowed out. So he's more of an anti-hero now. And like I said, he's immensely popular. Like, he is starring in 4 limited series this fall at the same time. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And so now talk to us about Tim Drake, the next one who comes along.
So Tim is a Batman super fan. Tim was created, if Jason was like, let's just do Dick Grayson again, Tim was, let's create a character who is exactly like our readers, and then they'll have to love him.
Okay.
So Tim, when he was a very small child, he went to the circus with his parents, and he was there the night that Dick's parents died.
Okay.
So it was a super formative experience for him. But he also knows that Dick Grayson is one of the few acrobats in the entire world who can do this like one particular stunt. It's like a quadruple somersault or something.
Okay.
So a few years later, when Tim's only like 8, he's watching the news, and Batman and Robin are in the news, and Robin does a quadruple somersault. And Tim, again, is 8, and he's like, oh my god, Robin is Dick Grayson, which means Batman is Bruce Wayne.
Okay. I'm also, my mind is running a little bit with the idea of a Simone Biles as Robin at some point in time, if we do like a crossover with real life, but if she ever wants to be a comic book character, but moving on beyond that. Okay.
That would be amazing.
So he's figured this out, and I assume he, does what 8-year-old boys do with information like this.
Well, he's a weird little secretive child, so instead, and his parents are pretty neglectful. So Titans, I believe, is like, I think he's an orphan in Titans. He's in like a foster home. In the comics, he comes from like a wealthy family, and his parents are alive at this point, but they are off on like safaris and stuff, with Green Arrow's parents killing lions. And no, they're not. Green Arrow's parents are dead, okay. But they're like off like on archaeological digs and stuff, and
doing rich people things. Yeah,
they're doing rich people things, and so Tim is kind of just left to his own devices. So he spends his time following Batman and Robin around and like photographing them, and he's just obsessed with them. And so he knows when Dick stops being Robin and Jason starts, and he knows when Jason dies, and he sees that Bruce is losing his mind, that he is like getting more and more reckless. So he shows up at Dick's apartment in New York, not even Gotham, and he's like, hey, you have to be Robin again. And Dick is like, who are you?
Oh, wow. Okay.
And by this point, Tim is 13, so Dick's basically like, well, I'm not going to be Robin again, but you could be.
Uh-huh.
Because Tim very firmly believes that Batman needs a Robin, like, to function.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I was getting throughout this, is that at some point it feels like it's no longer that Batman is finding people who need to be Robin, it's that he needs a Robin. He himself needs a Robin. And that's awesome to me, because I do feel like a lot of times when we talk critically about Batman, there's sort of a sense of we are using the analysis of the 2020s to read into a character from the 1950s or 1970s or 80s or 90s. And I don't think that's a good thing to do. I don't think it's wrong, but it's clear that the writers don't think there's anything problematic, And it's nice to hear that in some of these later versions, like, no, the Batman writers definitely do think, like, Batman might not be Father of the Year to all of these siblings, and that maybe Batman does need Robin in some unhealthy ways. And so it's really interesting to hear that, like, that actually is legitimately, like, written into these things that far back.
Well, I don't know that it was necessarily being posited as an unhealthy thing. I mean, whether we think it is. And I think also, like, you kind of have to separate the idea of, should we let 12-year-olds fight crime, as unhealthy from like, are the specifics of the Batman and Robin relationship unhealthy? Because like
Right.
obviously Robin should not be happening at all
Yeah.
because that's insane. Don't do that. But you kind of have to go with it in a
Right.
superhero universe. But yeah, like it's very metatextual. Like the reason that Robin was introduced in 1940 was because Batman was so grim and needed
Mm.
something to lighten him up, and that's what Robins do. Even the ones who are not necessarily as perky, like Tim or Damien,
Right.
they add color to the scene. They add banter and cheer, and it's also narratively, it's just useful to have somebody for your character to talk to.
Yeah. It's funny. There's actually a line in season 1 of Titans where Jason is talking about like why Batman needs them, and he says like he does say something about like we help cheer him up or whatever, but then he says in this very sort of like brash 17, 18-year-old nothing can ever hurt me way, he literally says, well, and Dick, why do you think we wear color? It's our job to draw the fire.
Oh, bless.
And like you're just like, oh, you are so proud of the fact, because this is a joke that often gets made of that the Dark Knight, the Bat who sneaks around in the darkness, has his sidekick wear bright colors so the bad guys will all shoot at the sidekick and not notice him. And like that's putting a lamb out to slaughter. Hopefully, dear God, that's not actually what Bruce is thinking.
Yeah.
But to have Jason Todd actually say that, but in this proud, like, how awesome is it that I can be cannon fodder, but really good dodging cannon fodder to help him do the stuff? You're just like, oh, it's such a heartbreaking moment.
Oh, Jason. There was
Right?
actually, I was going to say earlier and I forgot, one of my favorite lines that Jason or any Robin has ever said is when Jason is Robin, there's like a bit where he's, they're going out to fight crime and Bruce says something like, be careful, or like, look out, this, whoever they're facing is dangerous or whatever. And Jason says, he's like, oh, don't worry about it, it's fine. And then he says, being Robin makes me magic.
Oof.
Like, he's untouchable because he's Robin, and it's just like I want to cry every time.
Oh, wow.
I should note that 3 of the 5 Robins have died. They're all back now, but
Right. I mean,
high fatality rate here.
compared to the fatality rate of DC characters, which overall is not low. But yes, I agree with you. Anyway, so let's talk more about Tim Drake.
Yeah, so Tim becomes the new Robin. Like basically argues his way into being the new Robin, and Tim is if Dick is the golden boy and Jason is kind of the bad boy, the street kid, Tim is the smart one. He's good at I mean, this is also because he's becoming Robin in the early 90s, but he's a hacker. Like he's good at computers. And he like skateboards and stuff. Like he's very 90s.
Oh boy.
But
does he wear the jeans that like hang down and half his boxer shorts are showing, and he's got a long chain that his wallet is on?
Eventually, not in like 91, but by like 97 for sure.
Okay.
But Tim is a detective more than the other characters are. Obviously, like he figured out Batman's secret identity. Like he's very much, not that he's like not good in a fight, but he is by far like, he's the nerdy Robin. He's the smart Robin. And this is something that's played up to beautiful effect in the recent story where he it comes out is probably the best way to say it, even though that's not exactly what happens, because he's such an internalizing character. He's such a thoughtful character and an introspective character who takes a very, very long time to work things out for himself. Mm-hmm. And so he's, mulling this over and trying to figure out who he is and what he wants. It works so beautifully with the character that has been established now for 30 years. But we can come back to that. So Tim is Robin from 89 to 2009, with a brief break in 2004 when Stephanie Brown becomes Robin. So Tim's mother dies very early on, but his father is alive until 2004. And his father finds out that he's Robin and is like, no, no, and basically makes him stop. Stephanie Brown had been introduced back in 92 as Spoiler, another teenage vigilante. Her father is this loser supervillain called the Clue Master, who's just like the Riddler. He leaves clues to his crimes.
Okay.
And Steph hates him, and she starts leaving her own clues to spoil his crimes, hence the spoiler.
Oh, dear
Um,
Lord.
I I mean, she's my favorite.
Okay.
I love her so much. And in terms of like spunky, optimistic Robins, she is by far both the most cheerful and the best adjusted.
Okay.
Probably because Bruce isn't her dad the way he is everybody else's.
Let me back up to Tim Drake then to ask a question, then we can go back, continue with Stephanie. So am I right that Tim, obviously he had this like psychologically affecting experience of watching the Graysons fall to their death, but it sounds like he is not as he is not as like traumatized and needing to work out that trauma through, well, not that being a Robin is the need. Let me re-say that. So with Tim, am I correct that he has had this very traumatic experience, certainly of watching the Graysons fall to their death, but he doesn't have the same, like, my parents died, I'm not over it, and being Robin is presented as a way to, like, deal with that childhood trauma that threatens to consume him the way it would have possibly Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, and Bruce Wayne. Is that correct, that Tim doesn't quite have that psychological need to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. Tim certainly comes in for his share of trauma later, but at the outset, he is not, and really I don't think he has ever been motivated by trauma. Like Bruce, Dick, Jason, all motivated by trauma. Tim is motivated more by being a fanboy, honestly, but he's motivated by admiration. He sees something good happening. He sees that Batman and Robin help. Like he loves Batman because when Dick Grayson is crying over his parents' bodies, Batman shows up and comforts him. So to Tim, it's a very aspirational thing. For Steph, at first it's spite, and then it becomes much more about she is explicitly motivated by hope. Like she says to Damien at one point, what we do doesn't have to be motivated by fear. There's room for hope, which is one of my favorite lines.
That's a great line.
And Damien is motivated by legacy because he's Bruce's kid.
Okay. And so this actually raises another really good question that I think is kind of essential to understanding who Robin is. And I will say some of the later Batman animated, not Batman the animated series, but the one that came after it.
The Batman?
The Batman, yes, thank you. It explored this quite interesting ways, which is the relationship between Robin and Batgirl. And in that one, like, there's a lot of jealousy between the two of them, and Batgirl kind of being a little more on the outside, and Robin being kind of a dick about that. And I think often, therefore, the public perception is often that Robin is a boy, and if there is a female sidekick who's also younger, then that's Batgirl. Stephanie, my understanding is Stephanie has been both Robin and Batgirl. So what is Robin that, if Robin is not just a male version of Batgirl, which awesome, let's throw, question all the gender lines here. What does it tell us more about who is Robin and how is that different from her being Batgirl?
I think Robin, while Robin can absolutely have his or her own stories, Robin is a sidekick, whereas Batgirl is an ally.
Okay.
Batgirl has always operated, like, especially in the cases of Dick and Jason and Damien, like, they live under Bruce's roof. Like, they're right. His sons. They live with him. Tim, very much, like, his dad never knows where the hell he is. He spends a lot of his time in Wayne Manor, and then after his dad dies, Bruce adopts him too. And during the few months that Steph was Robin, she was absolutely, like, squire to Bruce's knight. Whereas even though Bruce has also adopted or offered to adopt Cassandra Cain, who is the second Batgirl, the Batgirls are much more independent. Like when Barbara Gordon first became Batgirl, she was an adult woman. She has a living father. Commissioner Gordon. Like, they don't, the Batgirls do tend to, they definitely work with Batman, and some of them, at times, it depends on the era and depends on the relationship, will take direction, not orders, but direction from him, but they aren't sidekicks in the
Okay.
same way.
Yeah, that feels like a very, and sounds like they're not certainly that their alter ego is not, adopted by, and they don't have a parental relationship with Bruce Wayne.
With Cass is the exception. Cassandra Cain
Right.
is much more of sort of a daughter to Bruce, but Barbara definitely not. Steph definitely not. But also not. She's the outlier with the Robins too. But yeah, so she had this identity as Spoiler, and she and Tim were friends and eventually started dating. And then when Tim's father said you can't be Robin anymore, Steph was like, I'll do it. And she was Robin for a few months, and then she was killed by Black Mask, who's the villain in Birds of Prey.
Okay.
And so when Jason Todd died, he got a memorial case in the Batcave with his costume in it. It says "a good soldier" on the bottom, which is just the most fucked up way to memorialize your dead son
Wow.
possible.
Yeah,
It's messed up. Steph didn't have a memorial case, and DC editorial was like, well, she wasn't really Robin.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oof.
Uh-huh.
I should also say, by the way, in terms of just the deaths of some of these characters, in something that is not quite the comic continuity, but still is a very important continuity, I think, for many people, myself included, the animated verse, the animated TV shows. Tim Drake, some people might know him because he is spoilers for Batman Beyond, if you haven't seen that, but I think this is a fairly well-known thing, and we talk about an episode I did with Paul not very long ago. He is the former Robin who is very bitter about what happened with Batman, and who winds up being, in part because of his bitterness and anger, but mostly because of, a chip and, wacky technology, taken over by the Joker. And becomes the main antagonist of the I believe it's the Batman and Beyond movie. So just to kind of tie those dots together.
And what's interesting about the Batman the Animated Series version, or the DCAU version of Tim, is that in personality and backstory, he's actually Jason. Like, that's Jason.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
They just called him Tim because Tim was the Robin when the show was airing. And so even though I'm pretty sure that the Batman Beyond movie that you're talking about predates Jason's return as the Red Hood, it's very much in keeping, it's much more in keeping for Jason than it would be for Tim, which makes sense because that character is was much more drawn from Jason in the comics.
Got it. Okay. And we're going to focus on those top three, but just give us a quick rundown also of Damian Wayne, the most recent / current.
Right. So just to take us home, so Steph was killed off. She comes back a few years later, and they're like, oh, she wasn't dead. She was just hiding somewhere. She's fine. Okay. So she comes back as Spoiler, thinks she's Batgirl for a couple of years. Then the New 52 erased her from continuity. She came back as Spoiler a little bit after that, so she's back as Spoiler. In 2006, Bruce Wayne finds out that he has a biological child with Talia al Ghul, the daughter of Ra's al Ghul. I'm sure they've been in many of the animated films, but also the Nolan films.
Right.
Although they are not white people in the comics. So Bruce and Talia have a son, Damian. His conception may or may not have been consensual. It depends on the comic, but in some of the comics, Talia drugged Bruce, which is
okay. Yeah, to be very clear, there's never a thought that Bruce Wayne non-consensually impregnated her. It's okay. Just to be very clear on that. Yeah.
No, Bruce is the victim, or they just had a night together. It really depends on the comic. So when Bruce meets Damian, he is 10 years old. He has been raised by the League of Assassins. He has murdered many, many people and doesn't understand why that's bad. Okay. And he is ready to accept his legacy as the heir to the Bat and the League of Assassins. And he does not really understand why there's this other boy in the cave. So he's going to kill him. And Tim is like, what?
Oh, boy.
It's pretty great. Damian is a horrible little monster when he's introduced, and I love him so much. But essentially, what winds up happening is that Bruce dies shortly. He's not actually dead. He's lost in time, but everybody thinks he's dead. And Dick has to take over as Batman. And he's like, listen, Tim, my guy, the only way I can control Damian is if I tell him he can be Robin, so you need to be something else. And Tim is like, excuse me? Robin is the only thing I've ever cared about in my whole life. And Dick's like, I already gave him the costume.
Oh, wow.
Which is when Tim changes his code name to Red Robin.
Red Robin. Okay, sorry. Had to do that at least once.
I should also note real quick that at this particular point, this is right after Stephanie died, so that's Tim's girlfriend. His dad died. His fake dad, Bruce, died. And his two best friends, Superboy and Kid Flash, died, all within like a couple of years of each other in the comics, which, because of time compression, is like a week for Tim.
Right.
So he had a really bad week.
Okay, so with Tim and with Stephanie, we had a brief moment of it is possible to be Robin without guaranteeing that you're going to put the children of some therapist through college. But then with Damian, we go right back to the like deeply, deeply troubled.
Oh, he's like I said, he's a little monster when he first shows up. And in terms of like relationships between Batman and Robin, the relationship between Dick as Batman and Damian as Robin is actually wonderful. Because Dick is so much more of a nurturing person than Bruce.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, it was very lucky for Damian that Bruce, fake died and got lost in pilgrim times when Damian showed up, because Dick kind of teaches him how to be a person.
Okay, I can see that.
And to this day, they have a truly lovely relationship. And so Damian has stayed Robin this entire time. Steph is Spoiler, Jason is the Red Hood, Dick is Nightwing when he does not have to sub in as Batman, and Tim, as we said, became Red Robin when he couldn't be Robin anymore. And then last year, 2019 maybe, he very briefly experimented with calling himself Drake as a code name, but that's just his last name.
Oh, okay.
And he had like a new costume to go with it that was very ugly. It was very embarrassing for everyone. And it was so embarrassing that like a few issues later, he went back to being Red Robin, and everybody like made fun of himself in the comic for like, oh, that was a bad idea.
Oh boy. Okay.
And so in the recent story where he comes out, he is actually using the code name Robin because Damian is out of town. And so can't catch him doing it, because Tim is all he's ever wanted is to be Robin, and he's never quite settled into Red Robin, even though it's been over a decade. And it's interesting because if you look at like when DC promotes these stories, because the story that he came out in is in an anthology book called Urban Legends. Mm-hmm. And Urban Legends has several stories in it. And if you look at the covers of these issues, it'll say stories featuring Red Hood, Batgirl, Huntress, whoever, and Tim Drake.
Okay, because not everybody needs a secret hero identity. That's fair.
Yeah, I guess not.
So let's talk about some of the dynamics that happen in the Batman-Robin dynamic. I think we've been kind of bouncing around a bit, but I want to kind of drill down on some of those, and then we can get to kind of looking at those first three, especially like while they're out on their own. And I will note, by the way, that actually no, I took it out. So first, just to kind of start this off, you mentioned at the beginning, but I think it's very important, especially in terms of getting to where Tim winds up, that when Robin was started, Robin was added in part to, help make Batman not be so grim and things like that. Talk also, though, but obviously that, like, this is all happening during the comics code, and there's all this fear about sexuality and things like that in comics. Where does Robin play into that? Because obviously today we look back on it and, grown man and 12-year-old boy, and the grown man's dressing up the 12-year-old boy in these skin-tight outfits. Like, there's a lot of bad places our brains go, and those jokes have been made hundreds and hundreds of times. And certainly more modern, critics of Batman have often said, like, oh, it's homoerotic, blah, 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 blah. What's the actual history of that? In, 30 seconds or so.
Okay, go. So, oh God, I'm like blanking, trying to figure out how to describe this quickly. Right. So the earliest accusations or allegations, or however you want to put it, that there is a homoerotic subtext to Batman and Robin's relationship, generally are attributed to Dr. Frederick Wortham, our old friend, the psychologist who basically believed very firmly that comic books led directly to juvenile delinquents. And he wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, alleging exactly that. There were Senate hearings about how dangerous comics were, and he testified at them. It was a whole thing. Those were primarily about sort of the violence and nihilism in comics. They are best known today, and Seduction of the Innocent is best known today for claiming that Batman and Robin are gay. That was like a minor point for him. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely in there. He also was like, Wonder Woman's a big lesbian, which is like, well, she's bi, but you're not wrong. Like, the gaydar is on point that one. And like the queer subtext in the Wonder Woman comics is absolute, and the kinky subtext or text is absolutely deliberate and canonical. And like, he was reading that very correctly. With Batman and Robin, there's sort of three possibilities here. Either it was completely innocent, and you have to remember, like, we're talking about, this was 80 years ago. This was several generations back, very different cultural mores. Right. So either it was completely unintentional, or it was intentional, meant in a joking way. Mm-hmm. And you see that in, like, it's definitely in the Adam West TV show. Like, they play that up for laughs.
Oh, it's very campy.
Yeah, it's campy, and it's steering into that curve because it's funny. Or it could be intentional in more of a positive way, like sort of an attempt at representation. Not that anybody is saying, what's great when an adult man adopts a 12-year-old and begins a sexual relationship with them. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. Right. But I wish that I could cite this more accurately, but many years ago, like right around the time I first saw that Stephanie Brown cover on the shelves, so like 15 years ago, I read a book called Batman Unmasked by Will Brooker, and one of the things he talks about, I think you would love it actually, but he talks about perceptions of Batman in pop culture over the decades. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he talks about is the homoeroticism, the homoerotic subtext, and he talks about men who in the 40s and 50s would say, yeah, like, I wanted to be Robin and I wanted to live with Batman and I'm gay. Like, that was part of that. That was sort of a manifestation of that. Mm. Again, nobody is saying that a 12-year-old boy is like, boy, I wish a millionaire would adopt me and sexually abuse me. Right. But in that sort of, I don't quite understand this dynamic because I'm a kid, but I'm really, really drawn to it. Mm-hmm. And he also, if I'm remembering correctly, again, I read this book a very long time ago, but I think I remember him saying that, like, some of the writers and artists played it up deliberately, not as a joke, but just like, I'll put this in the comic, like, not to make fun of gay people, but just steering into that curve. And certainly, right. Like, they had, like, the Lucy and Ricky twin beds. Like, the 50s were wild.
Yeah, and also to be clear, like, in Batman 66, Burt Ward, the actor, was 19. I watching as a kid, certainly thought that he was supposed to be, like, an adult man in his 30s and, like, a college kid. Robin in that TV show doesn't come off. I think they may say that he's, like, a late teenager, maybe he's, like, 17 or something like that. But he certainly didn't seem like he was 12 by any means. And then in the Joel Schumacher movies, which I think also and there we mean the I think Schumacher did both the second two, right?
Yeah, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin.
Right, and in those, which my view of which completely changed when I stopped looking at them as Batman movies and started looking at them as gay camp parodies of Batman, through the lens of which they're fantastic. And there again, Robin is clearly a like college age, like young man, not a boy.
Yes.
So just one of the kind of linked thing there.
Yeah. And I do think like the idea of, I think Tim is a really interesting character to look at in the context of the idea of a young boy looking at the relationship between Batman and Robin and being really drawn to it, and then realizing later in life, oh, I like dudes. Like,
right.
The fact, like, Tim is fixated specifically on the relationship. I was describing it to a friend as, at a formative age, he becomes obsessed with the relationship between a stern leather daddy and a beautiful boy in panties. Like, that's his origin. Mm-hmm. So, like, there are people who are like, I can't believe Tim is gay now. And I'm like, Tim's been gay since 1989. Or right. Bi. We don't actually know. It's not specified yet.
And here again, I think it's also important, like, in case someone's listening to this and thinking we're kind of like, stereotyping or fetishizing or something like that, it's a known thing that, like, children of any kind of gender or sexual orientation will often kind of imprint upon, as they're first going through sexual awakenings, like if, the childhood crush on a teacher, the childhood imprinting upon like, a friend of a parent or something like that, yes. Those relationships where if the adult involved does anything about it, it becomes horrifically abusive. But for kids to have those feelings or even look back on those feelings as like their earliest sexual kind of understandings, like that is kind of common. So for Tim to have had those feelings and that translate into him as an adult, realizing that he has feelings for not a father figure, but another adult male of his age, like that's not like, outside the realm of healthy sexual development by any means.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Thank you for the much more thoughtful explanation of what I was being very flippant about. But yes, 100%. And it's also, there's something also very classically Greek about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think that's a thing to definitely think about in all this. And even with Tim, like you talk about that part, but I also know that it's part of his character. I didn't know much about the character until this whole story broke, but I remember that you may be the one who pointed out in literally his first comic, I think on the first page, but maybe, later in the comic, but certainly in his first ever book that he appears in, there's scenes of like him being kind of adored by teenage girls in his high school. And he's kind of like, not really here for it.
Yeah, that's a thing. So that's in his first mini-series, that was like a Robin mini-series. So a little bit into his development. But when he like really started wearing the costume for the first time, this happens. And it is absolutely a trademark of Tim. And it's something that's very particularly associated with this one writer, Chuck Dixon, who wrote Tim for most of the 90s. But there's this trope that he loves where girls and even sometimes adult women will come on to Tim or throw themselves at Tim or like express interest in Tim to some degree, and he very uncomfortably is like, oh no thank you, oh I just ate, like no, yeah. Oh no thanks. And it's repeated, and I will say quite confidently that this was not intentional subtext, because Chuck Dixon has made a number of quite homophobic statements.
That's unfortunate.
But it's one of those cases where trying to depict, I think what it is like, look how desirable Tim is. All these girls want him and he doesn't want them. He's so macho. And I'm like, well, he's 90 pounds soaking wet, so I don't know if macho is the word.
Right. I mean, it kind of goes back to the stuff we talked about a while ago of, Lois Lane always chasing Superman and Superman being like, not today, Lois.
Well, it's like, again, because there were those accusations in the 50s that Batman and Robin were gay. So one of the things the DC did to counteract that was they introduced the character of Batwoman, Kathy Kane, who was a socialite who was not Bruce. Nowadays she's Bruce's cousin, but at the time she wasn't. And she was super into Bruce and wanted to, or Batman, and wanted to get with him, and he was always trying to avoid her so he could hang out with Robin. And I was like, how do you think this makes him look more straight? Just having a girl there does not make somebody more straight. They have to actually want to kiss the girl, which he clearly did not.
I mean, this sounds utterly ridiculous, but I still clearly remember being 12 years old, and one of our friends, of that age started to hang out with girls a lot and want to, do stuff with them instead of playing football in the park with us. And, my friends and probably myself joined in. I hope I didn't, but I probably did. I was 12 and an idiot, and being like, oh my God, he doesn't want to play football. He wants to hang out with girls. That's so gay. And then later being like, wait a minute.
He was with the girls.
But anyway, so I think that's really important. And I feel like, we've kind of jumped onto this topic, and let's kind of take it to its, we're not going to say everything we can about it, but kind of really put a point on it. With everything you're saying, it feels like this is why it is so important. Not just that, like, any main superhero character has, come out as being, and let's be clear, we know that he's attracted to a particular man and men in general. He hasn't, said that he's not attracted to women, so or non-binary folks. So he could be gay, he could be bi, he could be pan. He's somewhere in the queer umbrella, and he's not the first DC superhero by any means to come out. Although he's definitely maybe the first who's sort of been around with us. Like Tim Drake hasn't been with us forever, but Robin has, and so he's connected to that. So it is significant, but. Like, kind of just to put a point on it, what is the significance, you think, of a Robin, and Tim Drake specifically, but especially a Robin who is now no longer a Robin, coming out as being attracted to people of his own gender?
I mean, I think it's really important. He is, as Robin, one of the... I would say Robin is probably one of the 5 most recognizable superhero names in existence. Like, just a household name. Like, even if it's not the Robin that most people are thinking of, he's still Robin. And even if he's not necessarily currently Robin, he's still a Robin. I think that's huge. I would say he's probably the highest profile character. Well, no, because Wonder Woman is now canonically queer, and Harley Quinn is. But with them, he is the highest profile queer character that DC has.
Right.
Like, for sure. Back in 2011, when they announced their new 52 reboot, they said, we're going to make an A-list character gay. And I was like, is it Tim? Like, I literally, 10 years ago, I was like, is it Tim? It can't be Tim. They're never going to make Tim queer. And... It was Alan Scott, the least well-known Green Lantern.
Of course.
Just like, great job, guys. But yeah, I think it's hugely important that it is a character with such a high level of, like, he's an A-list character. He's an iconic character.
Right.
I think it's hugely important that he's a character who is currently appearing in multimedia projects. He is debuting in live action for the first time in this season of Titans. And I don't know if they're going to use this because it's such a brand new story, and it's possible the whole season was already filmed, but it's still really important. He's also a playable character in the Gotham Knights video game that came out or is coming out. Yeah, it's Dick, Jason, Tim, and Babs, I think. And like he's a character who is not just high profile in the comics, but he has been in TV shows. He has been in video games. He's somebody that if you love superheroes but maybe don't want to get into the weeds of the comics, which is understandable even if I keep trying with you, you're still going to know who he is.
Yeah.
But I also think it's important that it is Tim Drake specifically. And like, look, I don't think that a single member of the Bat family is straight, Bruce included. Like, no, I've read a lot of comics. No.
Him and Clark have a very complex relationship.
They're close. They're close. Like, they literally just introduced this guy that Bruce knew when he was, like, training to be Batman when he was, like, 20 and a hotshot. Who is queer, and I'm like, this relationship does not make any sense if Bruce and Ghostmaker are not, like, college exes. But Tim specifically, like I said earlier, he was designed to be the relatable Robin. He's the Robin, he's the little fanboy Robin, you know?
Mm,
He's the Robin who's obsessed with Batman, and like if he didn't live in the DCU, if he was in the real world, he would be reading Batman comics. Like
right.
he's meant to be the character that the sort of average, what DC envisions as their average reader, which is at the time that Tim was introduced was included tweens and teens, but now is like, you know, straight white guys 85 or 18 to 35. Um, that's who Tim is supposed to appeal to. That's who Tim is supposed
Right.
to evoke. And when you have a character like that that's designed in that way and that is aimed at that audience, and then you say, hey, this character can be queer, and it does not make him any less relatable. It does not make him any less like you or any less of badass or any less interesting.
Uh-huh.
That's really important, and it's for me it's very heartening because I've been looking at how people are responding to this, and DC tweeted about it a bunch, and they'd put up a tweet and you'd have like maybe 100 replies that are like, this is terrible, you ruined Tim Drake, and then thousands and thousands and thousands of likes and
Oh, that's
hundreds of
wonderful.
replies saying, this is wonderful, thank you, I'm so happy, I'm so excited, this is so cool.
Well, and it's interesting also that you talk about it in terms of like why it's so important that it is. Uh, it's interesting also that you talk about it in terms of why it's so important that the straight white audience be able to see themselves, all the straight audience, but especially that as like their target demographic, be able to see themselves in a character who isn't straight. But because to me, the other part, what I would think it is, and maybe I'm wrong, because I'm coming in as an outsider, but that I think this is such an important thing that comics are having to do, is also a recognition of not all of our readers are straight, not all of our readers
Yeah.
are men, not all, like, to me, it's also a real recognition of like, yeah, there are, all sorts of genders and orientations among our fan base. And what a great way of like, for those fans especially who so often maybe get told like, wait, you're a queer kid and you're reading comic books? Don't you know like these are for like straight white boys? Like, I know I've heard people of color and women talk about how important it was to have their fandom be acknowledged and appreciated. I can imagine the exact same thing could happen here if Tim really is seen, like you're talking about, as the kind of embodiment of the average fan.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I certainly didn't mean
Oh yeah, no, I don't
to
think you did. But I mean,
yeah, yeah, but I'm glad that you brought it up because that's also hugely important. And like DC posted like basically an op-ed on their own website after this issue came out, and I do want to pause also and note that the story about Tim, if people want to read it, can be found in Batman Urban Legends issues number 4, 5, and 6, and it was written by Megan Fitzmartin and drawn by I apologize, I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Belen, it's like Helen but with a B. I was saying it so wrong. I'm so sorry. Ortega, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely beautiful to look at. It's so enjoyable. They get the characters so right. It's a lovely, lovely story. So I do want to say, like, it's a great story. It's not just DC doing this. It is this creative team doing something wonderful.
that's fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for that acknowledgement.
But yeah, DC posted this basically this op-ed piece on their website that was like, this is a victory for queer fans who have seen themselves in these characters for so long, and specifically said queer fans love Robin. Queer fans have seen themselves in these characters, and listed off not just Tim and his relationship with his best friend, who's one of the Superboys, but Dick and his relationship with his best friend, and Jason and Steph and Damian. Like, again, nobody in the Bat family is straight, but like these, it is absolutely a victory for. I don't want to say that like I'm the authority on it, but yes, it is. It is something that I hope queer
Yeah,
fans and certainly every queer Bat fan I know is celebrating from the rooftops.
absolutely. I mean, to me, as someone who's queer and is genderqueer, like I just was so thrilled about it. And that's why I wanted us to talk about it. And we could just go so deep on Tim, and I wanted to just kind of make sure that those points were made. But pulling us back a little bit too, because I think there has been also a lot of other great commentary, and I'm going to try and direct people to some of that in the show notes. But kind of so Tim, at least it feels like he's getting to have a healthy relationship. He's getting to have some kind of a healthy life outside of his time with Batman. He hasn't come up with a good name yet, like Red Robin and Drake, both not working for us. I think we've been talking about it overall already, but I just want to kind of get back to this question for all three of them, as well as for Stephanie and Damian, but for the big three especially, like, what do you think is really important about, like, it's interesting now that we have so many different iterations of a sidekick, and yet also so many stories about that sidekick when they stop being a sidekick, you know? And I know we get that with some other characters, but it feels like Robin especially that's true of. What do you think is the significance of that? Why do we keep getting stories about Robin when they're no longer with Batman?
I mean, I think it goes back to the deep attachment that readers, and especially young readers, have to Robin. Like, you want to see the character, because the thing, like with Dick, he grew up essentially along with the readership of comics. So when the assumed reader was a small child, he was a small child. And when the assumed reader was a tween, he was a tween. And when the assumed reader was in high school, he was in high school. So he doesn't grow up in real time, but he does grow up with the people who are reading him. But we get attached. We can't have, I mean, and it's a running joke with Tim, because Tim was introduced in 1989 as a 13-year-old, and he has scooted up to 18 and then back down to 16 and then up to 18 and then back down to 16 like 5 times. Like,
Okay.
he keeps almost going to college and not quite making it. But they do grow over time. We see them grow over time, and they age out of the Robin costume, or they die. But we don't want to let go of them because we're attached to them, and because Batman is such a rich character and such a rich franchise that you can do so much with that dynamic. Like, even once the Robin is no longer Robin, there's still so much narrative meat there, and
Right.
also between those characters, because all 5 of these characters have a really interesting dynamic together.
It's interesting how, on the Marvel side of things, the Fantastic Four, they're always talked about as, the first family of Marvel, the first family of comics in terms of like all their interfamily dynamics and drama. And maybe that element of, in the 60s, we weren't getting that from DC. But certainly I feel like at this point, the Waynes and Adopted and, corollaries can certainly rival the Fantastics for being, dysfunctional family number one, and also the family just where we know the most about their internal family dynamics, and where the family dynamic, like the effect of Bruce Wayne as a adoptive parent in both clearly a lot of negative but also some positive ways, I think definitely, are just so significant for the stories of so many major characters now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say the Waynes, or the Bat family, however you want to put it, are significantly more dysfunctional than the Storm Richardses,
That's
Storm
fair.
Richards Grimmses.
One thing I'm really enjoying in the Titans show, and I'm wondering again if you see this in comics, and also just kind of talk about this issue in general, is that Dick at first, like the first time we kind of realize what he's doing, he goes out to fight crime, no longer connected to Bruce, no longer connected to Batman, very significantly now in Detroit, not in Gotham City, but he does it dressed as Robin. And there's a whole thing about Robin, the press is like, oh, Robin's back, and Robin's now free of Batman. And one of kind of the overarching themes of season 1 is Dick realizing like he can't be Robin anymore. And I start this because I think it's really interesting that all of these characters have a different identity on their own. Nightwing or Red Hood or Red Robin or, whatever it is. I can't stop doing that. But is that, what do you think is the significance of that, of each one of them feeling like, if I'm no longer with Bruce, I can't be Robin anymore. I need to kind of go off I need to have a new identity, not just my own independence.
Well, I mean, it's noteworthy that certainly neither Nightwing nor Red Hood were original to Dick and Jason using them. Red Hood, like I said, had been used by the Joker before, and Nightwing was actually a Kryptonian hero, like of folklore, that Superman had once told Dick about, and like Dick also very much looks up to Superman, so he was like, "That's a good name. I'll use that."
Oh, interesting.
So even within the context of the stories, they're not coining their own names, and Red Robin had been used by Dick in an alternate universe and Jason in a different alternate universe before Tim used it.
Of course.
So these are not original boys at all. But yeah, I mean, I do think that Dick's breaking away originally is less perhaps fueled by anger and violence than it seems to be on Titans. I feel like Titans really went for the edgy angle on it, and with Dick, I think he just kind of realizes that he's sort of, it's reached its end point.
Right.
He's outgrown it. Like, he's literally outgrown it. He's a grown man, and he's wearing short pants, and it's time to not be that. And there's a famous scene in the new Teen Titans where he like strips out of his costume in front of the whole team, and he makes a speech about how he's like not Robin anymore. So he's only got like the little green like unitard on underneath, and they're like, "Well, what should we call you?" And he's like, "I don't know. I'm going to think about it."
Nice.
But yeah, I think it's just it's portrayed as very much like a really natural coming of age. Whereas for Jason, it's very different because it was being Robin was violently ripped away from him. And then when he came back, like he crawls out of his own grave, and then he is in a coma and has amnesia for years. So he outgrows it in a profoundly traumatic fashion because he dies as a 15-year-old and becomes conscious again as a 19-year-old and is like, what?
Okay.
So I think he sort of has to forge something new because the name's already taken and years have gone by.
Right.
Like he doesn't really have another option. And then with Tim, he was sort of kicked out of it lovingly, but he was kicked out of it.
And I also think the point you made a while ago about how, like, we're starting to explore Robin exists, like, both as a part of Batman and kind of the metatext of, like, you know, Batman and Robin, the comics, but also just, like, Robin is a part of Batman, and that, like, Batman kind of needs a Robin. And so, yeah, I guess I can understand that. I think it's a very interesting commentary on that relationship of if you're no longer not only partnered with Batman, but if you're no longer Batman's sidekick, then yeah, you're no longer Robin. That those two things are really very much linked because, as you said, like Robin without Batman kind of doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and you can go off on your own temporarily, but you eventually come back. And we're seeing some really interesting stuff with Damian there because he is also, I mean, he's only 14 at this point. He's still young. He's not quite ready to outgrow the mantle, but he is definitely chafing in his relationship with Bruce. And so he's trying to pull away, but not relinquish the Robin identity. And it becomes a question of whether that is a possibility or not.
Right. Now, I think I know what your immediate answer to this is going to be, but I want to kind of like see if there's some depth to it and a little bit of both sides of it, although I think we're going to lean pretty much on one side. It seems like one of Bruce Wayne's central conceits is that he is helping, especially at least with the kids who are super traumatized, like Dick and Jason and then maybe Damian, that certainly with Dick and Jason, that he is helping them. That he see that in the same way that as broken as Bruce Wayne / Batman is, that this might be kind of the healthiest path that Bruce Wayne could have been on, especially given like whatever therapy options he had at the time. And then he kind of feels like, yeah, turning a Dick Grayson or Jason Todd into a Robin isn't maybe like the pinnacle of psychological health, but is a way to help them channel the trauma and the feelings of desire for revenge and desire for justice that is significantly better than it might have been had they run loose on their own. So I guess the kind of question is, I feel like overall we can kind of say, like, Bruce would have done a lot better if he'd hired some therapists instead of spending so much money on the toys. But, like, do you think overall the perspective of these stories, or your perspective, is that, like, he has done some good for them, even if it's definitely, like, very self-serving in a lot of ways and very much about the mission and not their own health, and has definitely left some real scars that are still part of the stories today?
Well, the thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about 80 years of stories and hundreds and hundreds of them. So this is sort of a debate that rages in fandom, right? Is Bruce a good dad, or is he an abusive dad?
Right.
Is the simplistic way of putting it. And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Because I can right now pull up a bunch of panels of Bruce being like an absolute horror show. Like,
right.
Do not ever trust this man with your child. And I can also pull up, plenty of panels that are lovely, that are really sweet, and that really show that Bruce did have a good effect on these kids' lives and a good relationship with them, at least at some point. And so, I mean, for me, I prefer a Bruce who's not great at this, but is trying really hard and doesn't always get it right, because I think that's most interesting.
Yeah, and probably most parents to some degree or another.
Yeah, for sure. So, like, I'm just thinking of a panel from very early on in Jason's tenure where he starts crying and Bruce goes to hug him. And I don't think this is on purpose. I think the artist just was bad at drawing hugs. But it really looks like Bruce has no idea how to do this.
Okay.
But he's trying really hard.
Yeah.
And, like, I love that.
And I really like what you said also about that there's some level of introspection of, like, that there's some versions of the story where Bruce sees how damaged Dick is and has some feeling of not only a regret, but of like, okay, what can I learn from that to try and do better next time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, like, I would say that for the most part, for the past, since the mid-90s, Dick and Bruce have had a pretty good relationship. They'll fight sometimes, but things are pretty good between them. They sort of buried the tension that was simmering for a long time. And Bruce and Jason have a really volatile relationship. And in the same issues as that Tim Drake story in Urban Legends, there is a story about Bruce and Jason that ends with, like, basically the two of them have to team up to fight Mr. Freeze and a new villain. And they're butting heads the whole way through. And at the end of the story, they are both... So the new villain has this drug that lets you see, like, your ideal world. And in both of their ideal worlds, they have a functional family and they're all together.
Aww.
And it's, like, sunlit and beautiful and wonderful. But neither of them are able to really genuinely make that overture. Like, they both kind of try a bit. Like, Jason's like, I'm not going to use guns anymore. Okay, goodbye. Because that's a big stumbling block for them. Obviously, Bruce hates guns. And Bruce,
right,
like, he just kind of lets him go, but then he, like, sneaks into his apartment and leaves an invitation to, like, family dinner, which is like, Bruce, you could have just asked him while he was right there. But it's one of those things where, like, they can't quite get there. They're trying to get there. But I don't know if they'll ever quite get there, because in the same way that Bruce Wayne will never actually heal, because then you don't have a story anymore.
Yeah. And I think that's certainly also true. And that's the, I've talked before about why I like Friday Night Lights, because it portrays a healthy romantic relationship between the two sort of main adult characters. And that's so damn rare in television. Because, drama makes much better stories. Happy relationships don't necessarily.
Well, and even in a TV show, eventually it will end. No TV show ran for 80 years.
Right. And I think also that's another point that you were kind of making earlier, that, and I think this is something that we deal with ethical questions all the time. By today's modern psychological understandings and understanding of child rearing and child development and stuff like that, I think if you created a story about a Bruce Wayne who in 2021 watches Dick Grayson's parents fall to their death and decides to turn 12-year-old Dick Grayson into a life of crime, like, I don't think there's a way to make that character redeemable. Because I don't think, like, there's any way to understand Bruce Wayne knowing what we know about child rearing today. I mean, I think you probably could have said this 80 years ago too, but especially today. But that, like, to apply that to 60 years ago gets harder, you know? And I think I like the fact that it seems they have taken, you know, like you said, there's a lot of ways in which the Batman Robin story makes sense at a time when homophobia was so rampant that the idea that there would be any kind of homoerotic subtext was not even thought of, you know? Or in theory, that was the case. It certainly never probably really was. But, like, just the cultural context in which the Batman Robin story has been told has changed so dramatically over those 80 years that I think, to me, it gives me some happiness that the authors are clearly understanding that and are trying to modernize the take on it, you know, and let us get to a point where instead of it being Bruce as just the perfect parent, that often it is, yeah, like, he did some real damage to these kids. And he also had some good intentions, and that all that we can live in all that complexity without being black and white, either that he saved these kids' lives with no consequences or that he was absolutely perfect.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you see that in cases of, like, both Tim and Steph are extremely self-motivated and becoming superheroes. They're the drivers in those stories. They're the ones who decide, this is what I'm going to do. It's not a case of Bruce finding a kid and going, okay, time to make this kid a superhero. And then with Damian, you're already in a situation where you have this 10-year-old who has been taught to kill. So what do you do with that? Like,
yeah.
There's this understanding that no, actually, you can't have a millionaire find an orphan and teach them karate and send them out against guys with guns. It's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said at the beginning, it's also very much a trope of the genre. Like, I also probably don't dress up as a bat to fight crime, and also, like, if you wear a domino mask, I'm still going to recognize you. But we let that go because it's the genre and we love the genre.
And I do think it's interesting, and this conversation was had a lot more between me and Paul on an earlier episode, but I'll give you kind of a moment to quick comment on it. I do think there's something very interesting about the fact that I think one of the most successful versions of a character who is a younger person who is being tutored and mentored by Bruce Wayne is Terry McGinnis, who is very much not Robin. He is Batman because Bruce Wayne is no longer physically able to fulfill the Batman role. And I don't know how much you've seen Batman Beyond, but to me, one of the most interesting things is how much that show was about a very different kind of relationship, in part because it's no longer about Bruce being the physical mentor. It's Bruce having to recognize his own age, his own frailty, and accept that now the new person who becomes literal Batman is doing what he can't do anymore. And that fundamentally changes the dynamic between him and his mentee.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's probably a good way to wrap up. Any other kind of last things you wanted to comment on or jump into before we head out?
I just really love Robins, and I'm very excited to see where Tim's story goes. We're not going to really get an update on it until December, unfortunately, but I'm looking forward to that. And I just really hope that, like, because there are so many Robins, he is a little bit of the spare Robin, because Dick and Jason are wildly popular. Damian is the current Robin, Steph is the girl, so it's a little bit different. And so that is, like I said earlier, I do think that Tim has been coded as queer for a very long time, but I think a big part of why DC, I think that's why the writer identified this as a story she wanted to tell. She said that that's why, but I think that's why DC was willing to take the risk, because if it doesn't go over well, they can kind of, put Tim on the shelf for a while.
Yeah.
And I want them to keep him off the shelf. I want to see him go on his date with Bernard. I want to see him find a new code name. I want to see him, tell his family. I'm just very excited to see where this goes, and I hope DC sticks with it.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm so glad you've helped me to better understand it. I'm not really excited to see it. I'm going to try reading some of these. I'm deep into a Thor project that I'll be talking about at a later point. So I'm reading some Thor comics. I am trying to kind of, open my brain to that particular way of reading things. I just don't process visual stuff very well. It's not that I don't like comics. I think it's a great medium.
Fair enough.
More to explain to the audience who are like, how do you have a podcast about comic books? We don't listen to comics, we read comic books. The one last thing I just will say, because I just think it's such a charming part of the Robin character, especially Dick Grayson, that I've seen in both Young Justice and also in Titans, and I'm sure comes up other places, is, Bruce Wayne, obviously, as he says in the Justice League movie, in the Justice League movie, one of a few lines in that movie I like, Flash asks him, well, what's your superpower? And he says, I'm rich. And there's you said to which he's able to hang with these people who have superpowers, both because of the incredible, to me, the world's greatest detective part, but also just he has these toys that basically make him a superhero. And there are some great moments that I've just loved so much where Robin has to kind of realize, wait a minute, I don't have any, I'm here with Wonder Girl and Superboy and, Hawk Girl and all these people, and they have flying and laser eyes and I have a metal rod. And it's just kind of a really fun moment of him still being able to be a hero and often the leader from this position of he doesn't have there's a whole other thing we can get into about how Robin and Harley are very much kind of mirror images of each other. And to me, one of the coolest parts about them is in the same way, if you watch the Suicide Squad movie, the most recent one is great. Jessica and I did a whole episode on it. Check it out. Harley's hanging out with all of these super amazingly powerful, badass supervillain types. And she can do a lot of flippity flops and has a metal rod, that she hits people with, or a baseball bat. And Robin's the same way, and it just makes them, to me, such relatable and awesome characters.
Yeah, I mean, that's the appeal of Batman and Robin, that theoretically any of us could learn how to do backflips and fight crime if we were also billionaires. There, speaking of the money, as a parting shot, there's a great moment that happened a few months ago in the comics. Bruce, quote unquote, lost all his money, by which I mean that he is currently upper middle class and not a billionaire.
Of course.
Which it's a whole thing. I'm sure he'll become a billionaire again very shortly. But Barbara and Dick and Tim all kind of find out about this at the same time. And Tim says, does this mean we're not getting allowances anymore? And Barbara says, you guys get allowances? And Dick says, technically mine's a stipend.
That sounds fantastic. I'd love to see that.
And Matt, you asked me what the difference between Robins and Batgirls is. It's whether or not you get an allowance.
Wow. Okay. There's so much to unpack there. We'll get to another time. But Jessica, as always, thank you so much. Love having you on here. Love your perspectives. For our audience members who want to find out more about what you're doing and thinking these days, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Jess_Plummer. I do a lot of writing about comics and other bookish things at bookriot.com. And I have a short story in Swordstone Table, an anthology of diverse Arthurian retellings and fiction from Vintage Books that just came out last month. So please feel free to check any of those out.
Yeah, it is a great story. I love it. We actually have a great affiliate deal where there's a link in the show notes to this. If you buy the book through that, you'll be buying it from a local bookseller. So Jeff Bezos won't get any of your money because we know he's not going to use it to become a superhero. And frankly, if we did, he'd probably use his superpowers to bust unions. So no super billionaires becoming superpowers, please. Just stop being billionaires. But anyway, yeah, so definitely use that affiliate link. It'll be a couple of dollars cheaper for you. Read the story. It's fantastic. The other stories in it are really great too. It's such a wonderful way to take these literally definitionally archetypal stories and tell them in new and interesting ways from voices that don't always get to tell those stories. So please check that out. And of course, let us know what you think of this. Who's your favorite Robin? What do you think of Robin outside of the Batman dynamic? Who do you think has had the best run outside of being Batman? Nightwing, Red Robin, Red Hood, Batgirl, any of them. What do you think? Let us know. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter at The Ethical Panda. It's kind of the name de plume that I use for publishing online. You can also go to the website, theethicalpanda.com, or just email me at theethicalpanda@gmail.com. There, of course, you'll find information about this podcast, as well as my other podcast, Star Wars Universe Podcast. We just did a full coverage of every episode of The Bad Batch. We're taking a break at the moment, but in a few weeks we'll be back and we're going to do coverage of Star Wars Rebels and starting getting ready for all the new Star Wars content that's coming soon. I've just heard that the Andor Cassian TV show has wrapped up production, so I'm super excited for that. Mandalorian's coming soon. New Boba Fett's coming soon. Lots of great content. It'll all be there. And of course, you can find these podcasts and so many more great podcasts on the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. So please check all that out. Check out Jess's writings, both online and in that great book. And most importantly, have a great day.